All right. We have quite a bit to go, so let's keep going. All right. So for the, if anybody have a question on the techniques, you can contact me later on. We can talk about a little more. But the most important part, I have already given those to you. So if you want to talk about the rest later on, that'll be fine. The cloning was an addition. So, but here we're going to talk about hemoglobin, myoglobins. We have quite a bit, so let's move on quickly. So first case, a 39-year-old man present to the emergency department with a nausea, headache, and dizziness. So a physical examination, and his lips or fingernails have a blushy tint. The arterial blood sampling revealed that the arterial partial pressure for oxygen is about 100 millimeter mercury, and the arterial partial carbon dioxide pressure is around millimeter mercury. And the nurse that took the blood looked at it, but we realized the patient bloods were oddly brown, the darker brown, so had a concern. And in the collecting tube, so it turns out he was successfully treated with the methylene blue. So which one of the following are the patient's condition? So keep that in mind as we go, so you should be able to answer that. At one point, I want to ask you the question again, and then you should be able to answer that one. Okay? Anybody know the answer? Or maybe you already seen checked it out? All right, but let's keep going. All right. So now this guy jump around, basketball, dunking. Now he start breathing very hard, all right? So it's breathing very hard because he needs oxygen to be taken in his body to go to his tissues where ATP gets synthesized, okay? So the oxygen is carried by hemoglobin all the way to tissues, muscles, where it releases oxygen to myoglobin, and the myoglobin nicely bind to them and slowly release them to the mitochondria where the oxygen is utilized. Keep that in mind. Oxygen is utilized in the mitochondria, okay? So you need oxygen for the mitochondria to function. So once the oxygen is consumed, water is formed, energy is generated, ATP is generated for. So the guy is breathing hard for that, basically to get the oxygen so he can generate more ATP, all right? So if you are deficient in that capacity to take an oxygen in, so you can, will be lacking in energy, so you'll be lethargic to a certain extent, okay? Now, conversely, when you eat your food stuff, they get digested, they go to a series of biochemical pathway, glycolysis, Krebs cycle, and so forth, and there is something called CO2 that gets generated. And you generate a lot of CO2 from the breakdown metabolism of your fat, sugar, and proteins, and that CO2 build up in your blood cause what? In your tissue cause what? The pH goes down, right? So they have to be taken out of your cells. So the CO2 also binds to the hemoglobin and histidine. There are other ways, but we'll just talk about the binding here directly to the hemoglobin, so carry it outside and into the lung where you get exhaled. Okay, that's why you breathe all the time to get rid of these things. Okay, so if you have a problem, taking these out, so you can accumulate, and that's your acidosis for you. Okay. Now there are two proteins involved with this oxygen transport, and the myoglobin and the hemoglobin, as I mentioned. Hemoglobin in the blood carry oxygen from your lung to your tissues. Myoglobin in your tissues accept the blood that is released by your hemoglobin. Now, one thing you probably noticed already, myoglobin is a monomer, just a long one peptide chain, while the hemoglobin has 4 subunits. And that is very, very important, okay? That's one major difference between them. And that is this reason that hemoglobin binds to the oxygen and give it to the myoglobin, and it takes it because of the structural difference. So you have 2 alpha subunits and 2 beta subunits. Now the hemoglobin, as I said, found in the RBCs, red blood cells, in adults called the hemoglobin A, 2 alpha subunit and 2 beta subunit. All of them have alpha helices. You know alpha helix by now, right? All of them are alpha helices. So 4 hemes are the oxygen binding site. So they have a quaternary structure, right? Why? They have more than one subunit. So you have more than one subunit, then you have quaternary. If you only have one subunit, you do further structure, higher order structure you can go. That's the tertiary structure. Is that clear for you? You just had that, right? So quaternary structure, more than two subunits, then you have a quaternary structure. So myoglobin doesn't have a quaternary, it only has tertiary structure. But hemoglobin has a quaternary structure. There are four subunits, all right? Now the alpha and the beta chains are linked by a strong hydrophobic interaction. Now the alpha-beta complexes, 1 and 2, interact by ionic interaction, okay? And that is also a very important interaction to keep in mind. Now, hemoglobin has 3 major regulators, but the fourth one, we're going to talk about it later on. But for now, oxygen stimulates activity of hemoglobin, the binding activity, and CO2 inhibit its activity, and proton as well inhibit its binding activity to oxygen. Is that clear? So the oxygen stimulate is unbinding to hemoglobin, but CO2 and proton inhibit oxygen binding to hemoglobin. Is that clear? All right. And that's important because we're going to talk about those things a little more. So myoglobin only has a tertiary structure, a single, it's a monomer. It also composes of 8 alpha helices, 1 heme, so 1 oxygen binding site, and it has a tertiary structure, doesn't have a quaternary structure. So the myoglobin can only bind to 1 oxygen. It only has 1 heme. Hemoglobin binds to 4 oxygen. It has 4 hemes, all right? So now, it's a picked up oxygen that is released by hemoglobin and slowly released to the mitochondria for utilization in the mitochondrial transport chain. So it doesn't have a non-regulators, just to release oxygen that is around, it just pick it up, okay? Now that's the structure of the heme, the oxygen binding site. We have your porphyrin in the middle, you have an iron that get incorporated, and this iron is where the oxygen binds to in the heme, okay? So this is your heme right there, and this is your irons where oxygen binds. Now, you have 2 important, now as I said, the heme, you have the heme, you have alpha helices, okay? So now it turns out you have a heme is carried by 1 histidine and the second histidine. Well, it's not carried by this one, but these are 2 important histidine that I want you to pay attention to, and try to know that thing in the board there is important. So this is called the proximal histidine. The proximal histidine is right there. Sometimes it's called residue 93, histidine 93, and it's located at the F. You have a series of alpha helices. So alpha helix F, this is located at that point, and it's a residue number 8. So all those, but usually people go by proximal and distal histidine, okay? But in case you see this, at least you know what they are. Now the histidine E7, histidine 64 in the molecule, and the alpha helix E, position number 7, and that's called the distal is this one. So this one hold the heme physically, but this one is located there. Its presence is needed to stabilize oxygen in the heme. So if you have a mutation that affects this histidine, the transport of oxygen by hemoglobin is affected, okay? So these 2 histidines are very, very important. That's why I want to bring it to your attention, okay? So if this, even though it's not bound to, but if it's mutated, the oxygen binding will not occur properly, okay? That's the structure. Now, I want to just refresh your memory on the ligand protein binding, KDs and so forth, just to remind you, to prepare you for the oxygen binding to. So this portion is just to prepare you for the oxygen and binding to hemoglobin and myoglobin. So if a proteins bind to a ligands, just like an acid base, now you have interaction, so protein ligand complex. Now, which is here, now the protein ligand can be characterized by what's called the KD. If you recall the KD, I didn't put the formula there, but that's not the crucial point for you. What I want you to understand, the binding can be plotted against, this is a number of the binding site, and this is a ligand, okay? So if the ligand concentration goes up, the fraction bound increases, right? If you mix a ligand and the proteins together, okay? As you add more substrate, the ligand, more ligand will bind to more protein, right? As the ligand concentration increases, the fraction, this is the fraction to the ligand, increases, okay? So now what the KD means at that point? KD means that the concentration at which half of the total ligand, proteins are bound to ligand, okay? So it means the substrate concentration, in this case, ligand concentration, that give you 50% binding. Is that clear? Ligand or substrate concentration, well, in this case, ligand concentration that give you 50% binding. Is that clear? So that's the KD. So, and the KD has more other importance to it that I want to bring it to your attention. It will help you to understand the next concept that I want to introduce. So KD, when the KD is low, the affinity is high, okay? So which means at a low concentration of substrate, you have 50% binding. How about if the KD is high? You need a higher concentration of the ligand to have 50% binding. So KD, the level of KD is inversely proportional to the affinity. Is this concept clear? No. All right, good. So high KD means low affinity, low KD means high affinity. All right, good. So now let's move on to oxygen binding. Okay, if your protein binds to oxygen, okay, as oxygen concentration increases, the fraction bound increases, okay? So this is your fraction, then the fraction bound increases until you reach a plateau. What that plateau means? All your proteins have ligand bind to, right? Can you increase the binding at that point? If everybody's bound to a ligand, so you can, in order to increase this, what should you do? Add more protein, right? Good. So here, in this case, look at the P50, which is the KD in this case. P50 is nothing, it's the partial pressure that gives you 50% binding, okay? As you see here, it's relatively low. How about if it was here? If the KD was here, let's say, for instance, for protein A, KD is here, and protein B, KD is here. Which one will have a higher affinity for this, the ligand? Here or there? Here, right? Because the KD is low. Okay, good. So for hemoglobin, okay. Now this is the binding curve for hemoglobin and myoglobin. All right. So look at it closely. The partial pressure of oxygen is increasing, right? So what should happen to this? So the saturation means fraction bound, okay? So as the oxygen concentration increases, and this is a curve for the myoglobin, so the fraction bound for myoglobin increases and then reach a plateau. But look at the hemoglobin curve, the fraction bound increase, but it takes a lot of time before it goes up. So which one, look at the two KD here. This is the KD1 for myoglobin, it's the KD2 for hemoglobin. Which one has a higher affinity for oxygen? Myoglobin, and that has a lot of meaning, okay? Because you want myoglobin to bind to oxygen where hemoglobin doesn't want to bind, okay? So keep this in mind. So in your lung, you have a higher concentration of oxygen. So now myoglobin, you reach way beyond the KD, so hemoglobin will bind to oxygen. Now imagine if you come to the tissue now, hemoglobin, this is the concentration in the tissue. Look at the hemoglobin. Is it bound at what level? How many percent of hemoglobin is bound at that concentration? Huh? Yes, say it. Somebody just said it. How many percent? Look at it. About 50% of hemoglobins are bound. Now, in the condition in the tissue, only 50% of hemoglobin will be bound to oxygen. That is the way hemoglobin can release oxygen to the tissue. Because you go to the lung where the oxygen is high, you pick it up, When it comes to the tissue, the concentration is low and you release it. Imagine, look at the myoglobin at that point. Myoglobin at what point? How many percent saturation at that point? Almost? Look at it. At this concentration, it's almost 100%. So at what point, one point when the hemoglobin releases oxygen, myoglobin binds to it. You see, if the oxygen concentration in tissue even lower, hemoglobin completely releases oxygen, and myoglobin will pick it up. Is this clear? So it only depends on the concentration, but there are other factors that also affect the affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen, what we're not talking about. But is this clear? This is the process. Hemoglobin can go to the lung, pick up oxygen. When it comes to the tissues, when the oxygen concentration is low, it will release it because the affinity is not that high. You bind to it when it's high, but don't bind to it when it's low. Is that clear? And because of that, hemoglobin can release oxygen to tissues. Now, question to you. If you have a mutation that increases the hemoglobin affinity for oxygen, what would be the impact? Can it deliver oxygen? Exactly. So you don't want a mutation that causes your hemoglobin to want to bind oxygen, even the oxygen concentration is low. All right? Okay. So now, in the lung, hemoglobin bind to oxygen, okay? And now it binds to for oxygen, okay? At that point, it's called oxyhemoglobin, and the molecule is relaxed, okay? The binding of oxygen to hemoglobin molecule relaxes it. Now, as it migrated to tissues where the oxygen concentration is low, you see it starts releasing the oxygen, and at one point it's completely lost the oxygen, and it becomes what's called the deoxyhemoglobin, and it is called tense. It is tense because it does not want to bind to oxygen anymore until it goes to the lung where you have more oxygen, then it becomes much more relaxed, bind to one, and then so forth. You carry it back and forth. Is that clear? So this is the mechanism of oxygen, hemoglobin bind to oxygen and transfer to tissue. Now, there are some concepts that we're going to talk about called the regulatory molecules, the allostatic regulators. Allostatic regulation means a small molecule bind to the enzyme or proteins, in that case, hemoglobin, and alter its activity, either stimulate it or downregulate it, okay? That's allostatic regulation, a small molecule. But in this case, allostatic positive regulator is oxygen. What that means, when the first oxygen binding to the hemoglobin is a little difficult. But once the first one binds to it, it makes it easier for the second one to bind, and the second binding to the second make it even easier for the third one to bind, and so forth. As you see here, from harder binding to more affinity binding, okay? So that's called the cooperativity. The binding of the first one is less than the affinity, it's a little difficult than the binding of the second one, binding to the third one, and so forth, okay? So as you look at it, the binding oxygen to the first, for the first subunit, the first heme in the hemoglobin, and the binding of the last one, the fourth one, the binding to the fourth one is 300 times faster than the binding of the first one. So you can imagine the binding, affinity increase as more oxygen bind to hemoglobin. Is that clear? So that's what we call cooperativity. Cooperativity, the binding the first one make the second one bind easily, the third one even further. Okay? So that's cooperativity. So it is a positive regulator. So oxygen is a positive regulator for oxygen binding to hemoglobin. Now we have other allostatic regulators, proton, okay? As the proton concentration increases, what happened to the pH? Goes down, right, okay, good. So look at these curves, okay, tell me. So which one has, this is the hemoglobin and this is a myoglobin curve. Myoglobin is sitting there, forget about myoglobin for now. Look at the curve. As the pH decreases, which means proton concentration increases, what happened to the binding curve? It shifts into there. Now, what happened to the affinity? Say it. Decreases, all right? As the pH decreases, which means proton increases, the affinity decreases. And that is important too, because when hemoglobin go to the lung, pick up oxygen, come to the tissue, when it finds it dampens because there is not enough oxygen, but 50% binding is still there. Now the proton will bind to it, it finds the low pH condition, which also going to decrease the hemoglobin affinity for oxygen, so it's going to dump more oxygen, which makes sense, right? Because it's in your tissue, you have a high CO2 that's doing a lot of carbonic acid, the pH is lower. Is that clear? Good. So low pH increase the hemoglobin ability to download more oxygen. Low pH decrease the affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen. All right. So here is, so pH, when the pH is low, the affinity goes down. When the pH is up now in your tissues, you see the affinity goes up, okay? So basically, as the pH goes up, you see the affinity start going out, the curve start going to the opposite direction. And that's very, very important. In the blood's pH around 7.4. Now in the tissues, the pH is lower than 7.4. So when the hemoglobin come and see a low pH, now he knows it's in the tissues now, then he can download more oxygen. Is this clear? Good. Now, all right. So in the tissues, in the presence of high proton concentration, low pH, oxygen is released. Okay? In the lung, where oxygen concentration is high, proton is released, because the proton also bind to the hemoglobin. So hemoglobin also transfers the proton all the way from your tissue to your lung and release it. Okay? So to control the pH in your tissues. Okay? So it's two gains here. Not only oxygen is delivered, but the hemoglobin also contribute to regulate the pH in your tissues. You have that on your first lecture. I'm sure I put it somewhere in there. So keep that in mind. So this is what happens. It binds to and take air from your tissues, and when it comes to the lung, it releases it. Okay? So this is called the Bohr effect, where the proton concentration, low pH, affect the binding affinity of a hemoglobin for oxygen. Now, the CO2 transport, you know, you're doing a lot of CO2 inside your tissues, right? So there are three major transport systems. Now, you have a CO2 can get dissolved in the plasma in about 5% of those cases. But CO2 can also form what's called the bicarbonate, carbonic acid and bicarbonate get formed, right? If you recall this. Now, it generates a proton, and then this bicarbonate can be exchanged out and then get transported all the way to your lung. But as you see, some of the CO2 can bind to it directly to the hemoglobin and get transported all the way to your lung. But also the proton can be bound to the hemoglobin, and then all those get transferred all the way to your lung. Okay? So in this direction, this is on your tissue. But now, when it comes to the lung, when it reach the lung now, if you can see here, the arrow is reversed back. Everybody see this? The green one now occurs. So the proton is released. The proton binds again to the bicarbonate. The bicarbonate is taken back in. And now you have a conversion of the bicarbonate with the proton to form carbonic acid. And the carbonic acid is now converted back to CO2. And now that CO2 gets exhaled out. Okay? So that's how the CO2 gets transported from your tissue all the way to your lung and it gets exhaled out. Is this clear? Okay? Is this clear? So this is called the Aldan effect, as you see in the green arrow. Is this clear? No question on this one? Okay. All right. So now we're going to talk about more allosteric regulators. It's called the BPG, 2,3-bisphosphoglycerate. So the BPG is a negative regulator of the hemoglobin binding to oxygen. As you see here, as a BPG, this is a normal BPG level. But as the BPG level increases, what happened to the affinity? Where the curves go? The red one is increasing one. Is affinity going up or down? Going down, right? So as the BPG level increases, the affinity of oxygen for hemoglobin for oxygen goes down. Okay? And then this is very, very important. BPG is a byproduct of glycolysis. You will see glycolysis later on. but it is a byproduct of glycolysis. Now, when if somebody go to a higher altitude where oxygen concentration is low, so your body want to be able to deliver as much oxygen as it can. So you start producing a lot of BPG, and that BPG level goes up in your blood and then force your hemoglobin to even dump more oxygen, okay? Now, if also the person has some blockage or, not getting enough, or smokers and so forth, not getting enough oxygen, the BPG level also can go up, okay? All right, now question to you. If you want to practice or prepare for a marathon, now you have a choice to go run in the mountain or in the seaside. Which section would you choose? In the mountain, right? Why? Lower oxygen concentration. So if you have low oxygen concentration in the mountain, so now you're going to program your body to produce more BPG. Once you produce more BPG, then you'll be in much better shape for the marathon. But if you go and lay down where the oxygen concentration is high, so your body becomes lazy, and BPG is not needed, and you start running there, you'll find yourself in trouble. All right? So BPG get it in the hemoglobin and lock it in the deoxy conformation and it stay there. So it decreases the affinity for binding oxygen. All right? Is this clear? All right, a few things that I think you should know, specifically in this case, when the blood is storage, you get, people give blood and you get storage. It turns out the storage blood has a low concentration in BPG. I guess probably the cell will utilize the BPG. So as a clinical provider, so keep that in mind when the blood is storage to the person. I'm sure the patient at this point, the blood, the blood that you're going to give it to a patient has a lower BPG level. Okay. So some people with so that's in high altitude. So people who have a chronic hypoxia, for some reason, obstruction, due to obstruction of some airway leading to chronic hypoxia or anemia, so they're not delivering enough oxygen, the BPG level goes up as well in those patients. But again, the key is the storage blood have a relatively lower concentration of BPG. So hemoglobinopathies, a few things that I want to bring to your attention. The methemoglobin. So normally hemoglobin, the iron is in the reduced form. Let me repeat this. Iron, it doesn't matter oxygen's bind to or not, iron, it's in the reduced form, Fa2+, okay? Now, the Fa2+ bind to oxygen. Now, it turns out in some conditions, based on oxidants and so forth, the hemoglobin, the iron in the hemoglobin is oxidized to Fa3+. And this one will now bind to oxygen. So if you have a lot of oxidized hemoglobin, your oxygen transport will be affected, okay? And treat it using, it is called methemoglobin, and you can treat it with the vitamin C antioxidant or methylene blue. Then you can reverse this one back to form the reduced form, and then this one can start binding oxygen again, okay? And it's commonly used in medicine. People who have methemoglobinemia, you can treat them with the methylene blue, and then or vitamins and so forth. But this technique is also used sometimes for the cyanide poisoning, okay? You're probably going to hear more about it. Because the cyanide will bind to methemoglobin, okay? And cyanide is a poison that shut down mitochondria, okay? And you do not want your mitochondria to be shut down. So what they will do in the treatment, a clinician will tell you more about this, they will induce a methemoglobin formation. So some of the hemoglobin can bind to the cyanides. So basically your cyanide will be relatively diluted. So basically you won't have any free or at least less free cyanide in your blood in order to bind to the mitochondria and shut down your mitochondria. Because it's best to have a few hemoglobin that is not functional that have your mitochondria shut down. Is that clear? And then they can reverse back again once you clear up the further treatment to clear up the cyanides out of body, and they can revert to your methemoglobin back to normal hemoglobin by adding methylene or vitamin C, to reduce your irons again, and then you have a normal hemoglobin. Is this clear? Okay. So carboxyhemoglobin. So basically, in this case, carbon monoxide as opposed to the CO2, now we talk about CO, carbon monoxide, will bind to the same site as oxygen binding, okay? So the oxygen binding is on the heme, and the iron is the heme, the carbon monoxide will bind to. And once the carbon monoxide binds, this binding is 200 times tighter than oxygen binding. So once he binds to, he does not want to leave. So the oxygen comes and can't find the binding site. So the oxygen comes and goes. So the person has a hard time oxygenating themselves because they cannot transfer oxygen to their tissue. Okay. I don't know if you see anybody getting, being exposed to carbon monoxide. When they come out, the person has a hard time breathing because they're fighting for oxygen that is not being able to bind to you. So what would you do in order to fix the person? Huh? Yeah, right. So what you do when you go to the hospital and the person has this carbon monoxide poisoning, what they do, they put a mask and bombard the person with a high concentration of oxygen. So basically, oxygen will compete for your site. Now you have more oxygen now than CO2 or than CO, and then once the CO leaves, mostly those binding the dynamics in the position, so they will compete for their binding site, and at one point you can kick all the CO out. So it is a competitive inhibition. So it binds to inhibit it, but it binds to the active site, which is the oxygen binding site. So you have to add more substrate. You'll see that in enzyme kinetics. So you have to add more substrate in order to kick the CO2 off. So they bombard you with the high concentration of the oxygen, okay? So 100% hyperbaric oxygen in order to treat the patient. So now back to our case. A 39-year-old man present with the emergency in the emergency department with a nausea, headache, dizziness. On the physical examination, his lips, fingernails have been blush tint. Now, if you look at the patient blood closely, the oxygen concentration is about 100 millimeter mercury, just high enough. The CO2 is 40 millimeter mercury. And the nurse noticed that the blood looked oddly brown in the tubes. So he was successfully treated by methylene blue. What is the patient's condition? All right, methylhemoglobinemia. So that is good. So that was the description that you have there to help you out. Now this is a little bit putting all things together. When the pH goes up or down, that can affect the hemoglobin binding. It's not much to say here. Just you can read everything that I said earlier. I'll look at it here for a summary purpose. Now, the fetal hemoglobin, on the other hand, different from the mature adult hemoglobin. Adult hemoglobin or hemoglobin A, but if you have a fetal hemoglobin from a fetal, it's called the hemoglobin F. Now, it's different from the adult hemoglobin because the adult hemoglobin, you have a 2 alpha and 2 beta. And the fetal hemoglobin has this another subunit that is different from the beta. It has alpha, but it has this one called the gamma. And that is the gamma hemoglobin, and that is important, okay? One characteristic that you have to remember is the fetal hemoglobin has a higher affinity for oxygen, okay? Why? You need to be able to bind to oxygen where the mother's hemoglobin dumps the oxygen, okay? So the mother hemoglobin has a relatively low, have to have a lower affinity than the fetal hemoglobin, okay? So the fetal hemoglobin has a higher affinity for oxygen than mother hemoglobin. So that when oxygen gets released and diffused, the fetal hemoglobin can bind to, okay? So, but it's less responsive to 2,3-BPG because the 2,3-BPG bind to the beta subunit. But the fact that the fetal hemoglobin doesn't have the beta subunit, so the 2,3-BPG cannot bind to it. And nature have designed things so it will not decrease the affinity. You want a relatively high affinity of fetal hemoglobin for oxygen. You don't want a BPG to bind to. Does that make sense? Okay, I think so. Yeah. So the fetal hemoglobin doesn't have, doesn't interact with the 2,3 or is less sensitive to 2,3-BPG because the beta subunit is the binding site for the 2,3-BPG, and the fetal hemoglobin doesn't have that. All right. So as the fetal, when the baby is born, as it grows, 6-9 months later on, then the fetal hemoglobin, the gamma subunit forms start going, the fetal hemoglobin start going away, is now replaced by the adult hemoglobin. Okay. Now, hemoglobin and diabetes mellitus. So, for diagnostic purpose, one of the things that is commonly used, people who's on diabetic that is non-controlled, or you just got diagnosed with the diabetes, one of the things they measure is the glycosylated forms of hemoglobin. Because when the glucose level is high for a long time, that glucose can bind to hemoglobin and form the glycosylated forms called the hemoglobin A1C, okay? Which means if it's high in the patient blood, it means the person's been diabetic and it's been for a while, okay? So it's not been controlled. So the blood sugar stay up, and the sugar been around for a long time, so then bind to the hemoglobin, and the hemoglobin become what's called glycosylated. And they will measure that. Means, okay, the patient's diabetes was not controlled for a while because you see the glycosylated form, and it's called the A1C. Is that clear? So now this is the different hemoglobins that normal, so about the normal concentration and so forth, which you can look at it, the fetal hemoglobin, the gamma, and so forth. Okay. Now the hemoglobinopathies, basically one, it's the sickle cell anemia. This one, as you see, the patients have red blood cells. Sometimes when you look at it in the microscope, and you see this shape, red blood cell with this shape, okay? They're rigid, and they can go around and clog around the blood vessel, and the patient has a lot of pain on that area because the blood is not flowing properly. These curved stuff can just kink together and block the capillaries and so forth. And then the fact that the blood is not circulating beyond that clog site, that can cause a major pain on the patient. And usually you see in the kids, they start complaining and so forth. Okay, especially in the S form. And so this is a normal hemoglobin that lasts 120, but if you have this, the fact that it's all the different, you're only there for 20 days and then or less and can be degraded. Okay. And this one, it is an autosomal recessive disorder. Okay. So now at the molecular level, what really happened is a single change. Okay. A single change, a glutamate in the position 6 is changed for a valine. Glutamate, it's an amino acid that is what? Hydrophilic or hydrophobic? Glutamate. Hydrophilic, charge or non-charge? What charge? Good. Valine, hydrophilic or hydrophobic? Hydrophil or phobic? Phobic. All right? Valine's hydrophobic. That's the key. You're changing a hydrophilic molecule for a hydrophobic molecule. So basically, valine is hydrophobic, while the glutamate, that is a normal protein, a normal amino acid at position 6, is now changed for a valine that is hydrophobic. That small change is the cause of all this disorder. Is this clear? So valine, glutamate is a normal hydrophilic, is changed now for valine, which is hydrophobic. That change called the polymerization. And the polymerization is because the valine being hydrophobic does not want to be in the water. So as a reason, then they was trying to hide away from the water, and they find a pocket in each other and form this polymer. Okay? So that polymer form, and it become, it form a lot of stuff. As you see here, this is a polymer formation, and then it become rigid and give this shape to the red blood cell. And now they form a kink in the, you see here, they come and crawl together in this area, and the patient, the blood's not flowing, you have all those damage occurring, headaches and so forth, pain in the area beyond the clot site because oxygen is not getting delivered. So now if you go closer to the molecular level, not that it's critical, but I just want you to see, you see it's supposed to be a glutamate here. If it was a glutamate here, you see these two together, S and S, they nicely interact together. Normally these two are supposed to be separated. But because you have a valine here, and the valine doesn't want to be in the water, so valine from this hemoglobin and then a packet that is formed by phenylalanine, which is also hydrophobic in this packet. So the valine is attracted by this little packet, and then they come and connect to each other, hiding away, hydrophobic, trying to run away from the water. Because of that single interaction, so you have polymerization occur, okay? And then you have that polymer, and then which lead to this long, sticky molecule that change the shape of the red blood cell. Is this clear? Okay. All right, so you can take this is the gel electrophoresis. For the diagnostic purposes, you can run those hemoglobin in the gel. The hemoglobin A will run relatively faster, okay? But the hemoglobin S, because you have a changes, so it will a little slower. And this is a hemoglobin C, same position, but it's a change from the glutamate now to arginine, lysine, I'm sorry. So in that point. So now you see this is a diagnostic for the hemoglobin S. Now you have the normal hemoglobin and the S1 to this one. Okay. And sometimes when it's AS, so you see some pieces here corresponding to a normal, and one here corresponding to the abnormal one. Okay, so you have two bands. Right. So the thalassemia is another disorder, blood disorder. Beta thalassemia and alpha thalassemia. Beta thalassemia, basically, you can have a partial beta genes defective or deleted, or you can have a double, basically both genes deleted. And that will be a beta thalassemia. And now the alpha thalassemia is the alpha subunit gene that is deleted. Okay. So those are the two thalassemias. So now, another questions here. Which of the following statement would be true about the extent of the red blood cell sickling in an individual with ABS and a hereditary persistent fetal hemoglobin? Did you take a look at this way? Which one of the statement will be true? Hemoglobin F increased the sickle cell disease symptom. Hemoglobin F reduced the sickle cell, hemoglobin S concentration. Hemoglobin F also inhibits polymerization, the deoxy hemoglobin. And hemoglobin F increased the B1, hemoglobin A1C. Which one is it? Huh? A, B, or C? All right, I like that. So the F, it will be B. So when you have hemoglobin F, hemoglobin F has what? A gamma subunit. Now the sickle cell anemia, the mutation is on the subunit, right? On the adult hemoglobin. So which means if you have a persistent hemoglobin F beyond 9 months, in adult, that can only be beneficial to you. Because if you look at the pathophysiology and the pathology of the hemoglobin in sickle cell, the beta subunit is the one with the mutations on it. And that's where you have your valine changing, the glutamate change for the valine. So if you don't have the beta subunit, so you don't have a polymerization. Is that clear? So if you don't have a polymerization, so that can basically be beneficial to the patient because the polymerization is the cause of the problem. So if the person has a fetal hemoglobin persistent, so you have a less polymerization because you have a less beta hemoglobin. So that will be beneficial to the patient. It will help him, offset all the symptoms associated with the sickle cell anemia. Is that clear? All right. Any question at this point? So this is a summary that you can take a look at, read on your own, and see. If you have a question, feel free to contact me. But anyway, I'll put this in the summary slide for you. It can help you study. Any question at this point? All right. Which one? Oh, the question here. It will be B. Hemoglobin F reduced the hemoglobin S concentration. Okay? but I was just giving you an explanation of how it reduces it. Okay? Does that make sense to you? Okay, good. Because if you have hemoglobin F, so basically because you have a lot of hemoglobin that do not have the beta subunit, right? And the beta subunit is the one with the mutation on it. So if you don't have a subunit that has a mutation, you have a less polymerization. The gamma subunit doesn't have the mutations on it. It's a beta subunit. So F doesn't have a beta subunit, and so it does not have a mutation, so less polymerization. Should I repeat this? All right. The hemoglobin F has gamma subunit, right? Now, in sickle cell anemia, the mutation is on what subunit? Beta, keep that on the beta. But in a fetal hemoglobin, the beta is not present. So in that patient blood, in that case where the fetal hemoglobin is persisting, so you have a hemoglobin, but that do not have beta subunits in them. So they will not polymerize compared to somebody who has all his hemoglobin with a beta subunit. Does that make sense? Oh, okay. Oh, that's another isoform of hemoglobin, which is the hemoglobin A1. That's the major ones in our body. So that's why I didn't talk about the hemoglobin A2. Yeah. So now back to the fetal hemoglobin. Let me back up on this one, okay? So keep that. One thing you have to keep in mind: if you have a persistent fetal hemoglobin, it is beneficial to you. That's the first thing you have to remember. And what I was explaining, that's the mechanism. The mechanism is because instead of having a lot of beta globins on it, now you have a GABA subunit. Does that make sense? Because the disease, the problem is the beta subunit, not with the gamma subunit. So if you have a lot of gamma subunit which come with the fetal hemoglobin, so you have a less polymerization. So you have a less disease process. Is that clear? So you want to reduce your amount of beta subunit. So now you have a fetal hemoglobin, so you have a gamma subunit instead of beta subunit. Okay, so that will reduce your symptom basically. Is that clear? Just take a look at it. If you have questions, feel free to contact me. We'll clear that. But it's simple. You probably look too far beyond, but it's very simple. All right. If no more questions, thank you. Say that again.